Welcome back, everyone, for the afternoon session, and congrats to the winners and participants. As noted by Henry, we're doing a session on delivering 20-minute neighborhoods. So I'm Amanda Chan from Ramble. I'm the senior consultant in the Cities and Regeneration team, and this is Mike Stephen with me, who is the GIS developer in the digitalization service line. So we're going to first talk briefly about Ramble and a bit of background on the concept of 20-minute neighborhood, and then onto how mapping was used in the project, and then onto what mapping showed us and leads to the next step. So Ramble is an international engineering and design consultancy that is founded in 1945 in Denmark. We're now operating and present in more than 35 countries. And so we find that knowledge sharing from best practice is a key component in our collaboration across geographies. We have a keen interest in livable cities, and also our new digitalization service line stems from the Center of Excellence in 2018, and then it became a new service line in 2020, in which mapping is a key component of the service line. So initially, we were commissioned by Scottish Government through Climate Exchange to deliver a piece of research and report on 20-minute neighbourhood in Scottish context. So what you can see on screen is the Scottish Government's definition of 20-minute neighbourhood. To expand onto this definition a bit further, the 20-minute neighbourhood is a place designed so that residents have the ability to meet the vast majority of their day-to-day needs within a 20-minute walk from their home. And for this piece of research, we've identified a 20-minute walk to be approximately 800 meters. That might be a bit shorter than what you're used to seeing in other research, and that's because we've taken into account access for all. Day-to-day needs are defined as shopping, leisure activities, access to schools, local services such as GP, and ideally access to work as well. It also means access to green space and a local environment that encourages active travel to promote health and well-being, as well as wider connections across and between local neighborhoods and further. 20-minute neighborhood is a place where people want to and can afford to live, so affordable housing must be a part of it as well. So one of the reasons why we were initially commissioned is that they needed a research to support Scotland's response to the climate emergency, particularly to support policies under the Scottish Government's recently published updated climate change plan, the Programme for Government 2020, the Town Centre Action Plan, Place Principle, and Place Standard. The desire to deliver the 20-minute neighbourhood ambition is also identified in the new spatial plan for Scotland to 2050 and the National Planning Framework for Position Statement. How the idea of 20-minute neighbourhood can address wider issues, including climate emergency, is by reducing car dependency. It can also tackle inequality by improving access to services and service provision. It can improve public health by facilitating everyday active travel to access goods and services, but also leads to a coordinated approach to delivering a broad range of policy intervention. So next, we're going to talk about steps that we've taken to turn our research and baseline study into maps and how we've used those maps to analyze and present our findings. So as previously mentioned about the place principle and place standard. So the place principles have been adopted by the Scottish Government, Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, and highlighted in the Planning Scotland Act 2019. The core commitment of the place principle is to create and deliver a collaborative place-based approach where partners have a shared purpose to support a clear way forward for all services, assets, and investments. The place standard and tool, as shown on the left of the screen here right now, supports local delivery and has been developed in Scotland to structure a conversation about place. It is used across Scotland at a community level to assess place based on physical elements and social aspects. We've then categorized features of a 20-minute neighbourhood to the place and well-being outcome, which is shown on the middle of your screen, and our categories are on the right of your screen, namely stewardship, civic, resources, space, and movement. This way, local authorities and communities can easily understand the outcome of the report and identify categories most require for future improvement and investment. I'm going to now pass on to Mike to go into more details.
So as Amanda said, each of these place standard dimensions, the 5 that she's just mentioned, they can be further split down into place standard categories and subcategories. For example, the movement theme can be broken down into public transport, active travel, and traffic and parking. And then active travel is further broken down into subcategories of safe cycle networks and walk and feel ability. Other 20-minute neighbourhood studies have often just looked at this concept using data in a quantitative capacity, but we also feel that qualitative is important too. So for each of these categories, not only have we assessed it in a quantitative manner, but we've tried to assess it in a qualitative manner as well. For example, with public transport, the quantitative assessment would be public transport stops that are within a 20-minute neighbourhood. But then for the qualitative part of that, we've taken data from Travelline on the frequency of public transport at these stops, which, as you can imagine, is important. For example, in a rural context, frequency of buses becomes much more relevant than, say, in a busy city when it's almost expected that you have regular buses at your bus stop. Moving, kind of to give you an outline of the process here of this analysis. We've got these place standard categories, and we're then taking data sets for each study. So for the Scottish Government study, we took data sets and then categorized them into the 5 broad categories, and then into the subcategories underneath. And then once we have our data sets in our categories, we then start to analyze them against the 20-minute neighbourhood concept using census output areas, which you can see mapped on the right. So these census output areas are the blue boundaries on the map on the screen. And we've taken the centroid of each of these census output areas as the starting point for our analysis. But rather than taking just the geographical centroid of the census output areas, we have weighted the centroid for population to give a more realistic representation about where people live and where most people in that census output area live. So then taking that centroid of the census output area, we've then buffered it by a distance. 800 metres is used in the Scottish Government project, as that is felt to be a distance of a 10-minute walk out and a 10-minute walk back, which would give a 20-minute round trip for the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. As you move to a rural context, that 800 metres becomes an unrealistic expectation. If you live in rural areas, you're not going to expect to find everything within 800 metres of your home. So in a recent project for Hightrans, which we'll be highlighting later in the talk, we've also included a 3-kilometre 20-minute neighbourhood, which would be the distance that someone could cycle and return within 20 minutes. So now that we've got our centroid and then we've buffered it by our distance, for the quantitative analysis, we're just essentially adding up the number of features within the buffered area. You can see that happening on the left-hand side here, to give an overall score of the number of features within the buffer of that census output area centroid. Then once we have these number of features, we can then assess across all of the census output areas a percentile scoring mechanism to determine what percentile each of the census output areas falls into, and then assign the scores, allowing us to compare relatively across all of the different census output areas within our study area. For qualitative data, we've assessed against the Scottish Indices of Multiple Deprivation dataset and national performance framework data as well. This is in the context of the Scottish Government project. As we've taken this analysis, the outputs are a series of maps. We can show the outputs either as the overall score broken down into all of these different place standard categories, or combining all of these different place standard categories. But we can also then take other types of score. We can only show the quantitative scores, only show the qualitative scores, a bare minimum assessment in the context of what you're looking at here is high trans area. The bare minimum score is taking the score for safe cycle networks, walkability, facilities and services, and natural spaces, and then I'm adding those together. The different scoring concepts, I can highlight key differences. So if you look between the two maps on the left and the right, as we move from the overall score with a larger range of categories to the bare minimum with a much more focused range of categories, you can see that some of these rural areas start performing better under bare minimum scoring. This output is from the Scottish Government National 20-Minute Neighbourhood Project. The provision of services, quantitative scoring is greater in urban areas, but satisfaction with community, the qualitative scores, is greater in rural areas. In every urban-rural category, there are neighbourhoods that meet the criteria well and neighbourhoods that met fewer criteria. But we feel that this policy has applications across both types of neighbourhood. At a national scale, it is evident that there are some neighbourhoods that appear to have the required service provision of a 20-minute neighbourhood, but it's not clear if they're performing as walkable, thriving spaces. You can see as we zoom in here, the difference. Obviously, the urban areas are performing better, these more purple scores in the rural areas, which we would expect, but there were also some other interesting results that came up out of this.
Yeah, so an initial concept idea would be all the higher scoring ones would be urban and all the lower scoring ones could be in rural. But as we start to zoom in into the map and we notice that that's not necessarily always the case. So we've zoomed into 3 different areas, for example, in a variety of urban-rural category. So for example, on the far left here, it's the large urban category area that is Tollcross, which is in Edinburgh city centre. It scored not only the highest in its category, but also overall. It has access to all the quantitative features and parts where it still needs improvement, for example, are qualitative data on influence over local decisions and children's voices. The other one is to be aware of is the quality of cycle routes in the area, and some of the walking routes are poor, which is likely to act as a barrier to certain movements. Whereas if we move to the middle of the screen, that is Pitlochry, which is under remote rural in the urban rural category 6. It's one of the highest scoring ones and still in the highest scoring category percentile. This demonstrates that rural communities also have the potential to form as a 20-minute neighbourhood with some key interventions. So in this instance, it will require safe and high quality active travel routes, better local public transport. Pitlochry also demonstrates the applicability of this concept across different types of area in Scotland. So now lastly, moved on to the far right of your screen, which is Hackhill in Glasgow. It's known on the sim that it's one of the most deprived areas in Scotland. However, according to our research, it's still scored relatively high in terms of a 20-minute neighbourhood. It does still have gaps in service provision and accessibility and some particularly poor scores for qualitative indicators. For example, in Hackhill, many of the shops are located in a large out-of-town style shopping centre, which is not designated for access on foot. However, that might be what is required for the environment, for the location and for the neighbourhood. So all 3 of these examples show both the potential and challenges of implementing this concept across communities in Scotland, which formalize into some of our key findings. That it does show that communities across Scotland have the required services and infrastructure to be a 20-minute neighbourhood in both urban and rural settlement. However, the assessment does not allow for the conclusion that the required quality of services or infrastructure is in place, nor does it conclude that these places are performing already as a 20-minute neighbourhood. So as this research is one of the first nationwide research that covers both urban and rural and both quality and quantity on the concept and application of a 20-minute neighbourhood, we've managed to got a few more opportunities out from after completing this initial first report. Our colleague Stephanie O'Gorman was invited to present our findings on the COP26, which just happened in Glasgow. Our report was also quoted and referenced in the drafted National Policy Framework 4. It's also included some of our recommendation in terms of policy intervention. Next, our colleague Rebecca Dillon Robinson was invited by the Rother Council to complete a workshop on how 20-minute neighbourhoods are applicable in rural settings. As kind of briefly mentioned by Mike, we've been commissioned by HATRANS, which is Highlands and Islands Transport Partnership, to update our research on a more local scale. We've also been recently commissioned by Edinburgh Council to update our research, focusing on testing detailed analysis, including network analysis, and support their circulation plan. So I'm going to first talk about a bit detail on our Rother Council conclusion and output. Spatial implications of the 20-minute neighbourhood concept and key interventions will have their basis in movement. There's still an understanding needed around what the key drivers for movements are for people across this district to allow for the definition of hubs and clusterings. Some of them have emerged through a workshop, which we've completed with various stakeholders. And now their notice for the workshop is that setting a time or distance parameter in a rural setting will be challenging. So the focus should be on living well locally. The workshop was ran based on discussions around local maps showing where provisions of services are. On screen shows some of the principles that propose to improve movement in Rother, and other examples of how to implement the discussed principles locally and integrate into local plans include having bus improvement plans, updating the Southeast Transport Strategy and central government funding, having household allocations in the local plan and neighbourhood plans, and into new neighbourhood plan areas and their possible alignments with servicing clusters. I'm going to pass on to Mike now to go into more detail on the HATRANS project.
Okay, so both Rother and HATRANS represent projects that take place in a more rural context. HATRANS is a transport partnership of 5 councils in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland: Highland Council, Argyll and Bute, Western Isles, Moray and Orkney. For the work with HATRANS, we went with the same model that we did as the Scottish Government project, but we swapped in more detailed local data where it was available. A difference between the two projects is that for HATRANS, we've gone as part of the output to produce this online dashboard. You currently see a screenshot of the draft version. And the dashboard, including the dashboard for as part of the output, allows for good visualization of the data. It's more interactive than just looking at static maps in a report. What you can see on the screen here is you can see the overall population density, the overall percentage score for a neighbourhood that's been highlighted, or census output area that's been highlighted on the map on the left. And then you can see its corresponding bare minimum score. And then underneath this in the graph, we can see the breakdown of all of the different place standard categories and how they score for that particular area. Another advantage of presenting the findings in the dashboard is it allows interrogation of the data by both stakeholders and public. We ran this analysis in HATRANS. We ran it for 800 meters, as there are urban contexts in the Highlands and Islands area, but we also ran it for 3-kilometre neighbourhoods to assess more of the rural areas. So moving on to the other part of the other tab on the dashboard that's displaying is showing the same stats, but again for the same area, but for 3 kilometres. Some of the outputs that we had from this study is that there were lower scores than for the National Scottish Government project. And the national project, Toll Cross in Edinburgh that Amanda mentioned, had a score of 99%. The top score for the HATRANS study was 82% for one of these census output areas. There are similar patterns across both studies where urban areas perform better and rural areas perform worse. But the value of this study for high trans is it provides data and evidence to these local authorities when they're arguing for resources. It also offers an ongoing monitoring opportunity for them to assess the 20-minute neighbourhood concept and any changes that they're making, any improvements that they're making. How do they perform against this 20-minute neighbourhood standard? Highlands and Islands Transport Partnership are also taking forward some local case studies, where there's an island, Isla, in the southwest of Scotland. They have a case study there, and there's another 6 villages in the Highland Council area, where, again, further case studies that are taking forward the 20-minute neighbourhood concept and seeing how it can be developed. Some issues that we've found whilst we have been doing these works. Data is obviously integral to the whole thing, all of this project. So with high trans, we were gathering data across 5 different local authorities. There's inconsistent coverage for data sets. It brings up questions of, well, if you have a data set that's only covering 4 of the 5 councils, do you still include it or not? Some other data issues that we had with high trans were there was little local qualitative data to swap in to improve on our qualitative analysis. At national level, we were using the Scottish Indices of Multiple Deprivation plus the National Performance Framework data for qualitative. But for high trans, the only extra qualitative data that we were able to add in was the travel line public transport frequency data. Some other issues that we're finding on this map on the right hand side of the screen here, you can see the extent of the 3-kilometre buffers of all of the census output area centroids. So these buffered areas are where our analysis is being performed. In the north part of the Highlands here, you can see there. It looks as though there's nobody living there. There are some houses, it's just that those output areas are particularly large. For some of these areas is falling in a more, and I guess in a local town concept where there are still houses that exist in the census output area that don't fall into these 3-kilometre buffers. So is there perhaps a slight skewing of results in more favour of urban areas, and even though we're assessing rural areas here, is there an underrepresentation of the issues faced by some of these rural areas? Another issue that we have found is that should we, and if we should, then how do we include access to digital services? Access to broadband is a crucial issue these days in living in a rural environment. So just kind of bringing on from that theme of questions that are being raised by these studies, what do people want and need in their place? We've used the place standard category to assess the concept of 20-minute neighbourhood provision. Other options are possible. For example, high trans recently commissioned another project into 20-minute neighbourhoods. It was at a kind of higher level than the work that we did, and it provided a list of daily rural needs, which also include broadband connectivity, access to affordable housing, community-led plans, community-led delivery of resources, and community-led collaborative relationships. What are the quality expectations that people have? Is 800 metres relevant in all places? Is 3 kilometres a reasonable value to be using in a rural context? Both of these studies that we've shown have taken the 800 metre and the 3 kilometres as just a circular buffer in Euclidean space. Could we use network space to give a more realistic representation and picture of what the services people can access within 800 metres, because they're going to be using paths and roads to move through space and onto these services? How do we link data and perceptions, and then how do we tie all this together and get behavioural change out of out of these studies, the conclusions from these studies. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Are there any questions?
Or answers to our questions? That works too.
Thanks for that presentation, Mike and Amanda. It was really interesting to see, actually. And I think you highlighted there some of the surprises that you get with the data that you can't really predict until you actually start looking at it. So it's really interesting, that was. Just looking in the chat, there's no questions in at the moment. If you've got any questions, please do put them in.
If not afterwards, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn, or our email is on the first slide.
Thank you. I was going to say, it's really interesting as well that you're looking at like the buffer zones, and like you say, if there's other ways in which other methodologies which you could employ which might change what you actually see. It might be quite interesting to see, actually.
Yeah, well, we've not weighted, like where we've used the place standard categories, we've just applied an equal weighting. We haven't weighted them at all to these different categories, but clearly there's an argument to be made that certain aspects are more important than others. But who makes that judgment and who makes that call? I imagine that it differs from area to area, it differs from organisation to organisation as to what their priorities are.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim's just put a question into the chat, and he's just put, what's your biggest challenge? So
Yeah, so I think we gave you a glimpse of some of our challenges by talking about the outstanding questions. So we had to make a lot of calls early on in terms of definitions. So for example, we then ended up concluding the access for all, we use 800, but then quality, quantity, do we use both? Are they weighted 50-50? So after that's decided, all the categories, what Mike was saying, do we weight all of them the same, like 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, or should we weight one over the other? So I think we've made a call for all of them initially, but all of them could be changed depending on the project. But that was one of the challenge in the very beginning, just to define the whole thing, just so that we can get it started.
Absolutely, and that just changes completely what the outputs would actually be if you do weight them, doesn't it? So
Definitely.
yeah, really interesting.